Well, I think it's worth backing up and looking at how China's role in the Middle East has evolved, because there's been a fairly significant shift in it, I'd say, over the last 8 to 10 years. China really, from my perspective at least, has three broad objectives in the region. One is it sought to maintain productive relations with all of the major centers of Middle Eastern power. Almost no external power has been able to do that, but China has. It's had productive relations with Saudi Arabia, with the Emirates, with Iran, with Turkey, with Egypt. And up until October 7th, 2023, it also maintained productive relations with Israel. If you contrast that with the United States, for example, it has a completely non-functional relationship with Iran, quite adversarial, is very close to Israel, and that sometimes creates tensions elsewhere in the Middle East. So China had been able to achieve that, but its relationship with Israel has shifted fairly significantly since 2023, and it's really gone into the tank. Second, China used to have a largely extractive relationship in the region. It was oil and gas, but increasingly it's focused on technology. And if you look at Saudi Arabia, for instance, Chinese firms are doing some of the Vision 2030 technology projects. AI, large language models, 5G telecommunications. And so really at the interstices of technology and construction, China has a pretty compelling economic offering in the region. And then, of course, China's trying to secure resource flows. So a long war is, as I said earlier, not beneficial to China's interests in that sense, but they're much more multidimensional in their relationships, and they're pretty well positioned in the region. They are unusually close to Iran. And I think they're not likely to put pressure on Iran for that reason. But I don't think they're likely to provide overt support that puts them in the crosshairs of the United States either. They'll do it quite
surreptitiously. So with that, so what role can China play in this, in ending the conflict?
You know, not much. I think we've heard a lot about Chinese mediation in other contexts. If you rewind a couple of years, China put out a position paper on the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and there was some talk about a Chinese mediation role. That's just fantasy land. It's a land of rainbows and populated by leprechauns. For one thing, it's hard to be a mediator when you're in the tank for one party and perceived as adversarial by the other. In that case, the Ukrainians clearly feel that China is overly close to the regime in Moscow. The same is true here. As I said, I mean, the Chinese have really tanked their relationship with Israel since October 7, 2023. And they're perceived broadly, not least in the United States, as an enabler of Iran in the region and more broadly. In fact, the Chinese ambassador to Iran went to meet the foreign minister about a week ago before this stage of the conflict started, and it was revealed publicly that the Iranian president, Mr. Pezeshkian, was planning to go to Beijing for a trip. So that being the case, they're never going to be perceived as a neutral or really an unself-interested mediator. And what's more, China really doesn't have a long history of that. If you look at the conflicts and contexts in which they've played that role, it's either been, for example, the UN peace process around Cambodia, where China had a direct iron in the fire because the Khmer Rouge was a Chinese proxy, but also because it was a UN Security Council P5-led process and China's a P5 member. Or North Korea, where China had direct equities because it has had a close relationship, albeit an ambivalent one historically, with North Korea. And so it both set the table and played a role. I can't see that really happening, notwithstanding some earlier developments between Saudi Arabia and Iran, where China played a role. I just think that's really a bridge too far. I think the Chinese are largely going to duck and cover and hope this thing ends sooner rather than later.
Yeah, Israel's endgame may be a regime change in Iran, but if there is a regime change there, what would the impact be for China?
Well, it would depend on what the regime on the other side of it looks like, but I think the Chinese would be deeply concerned. Regime change everywhere makes them nervous. They've invested a lot in these relationships. With Iran, for example, there's a 25-year cooperation agreement between China and Iran. They're a major consumer of Iranian exports, not least in the oil and gas sector. And so, you know, that economic relationship is not as broad as some sometimes portray it to be, but it is a close relationship for China, and I think they would be concerned that their strategic interests would suffer as a result of that. China's a very conservative power in some ways. For all the talk about Chinese revisionism, they don't always adapt easily to change, and particularly in situations where they're known to be close to these regimes, they don't adapt easily at all. The same would be true of Russia, for example. If you imagine a regime change scenario in Russia, the Chinese would be extremely uncomfortable in that scenario. And so even though some of these relationships are ambivalent and complex for them, they do better in terms of their planning and their posture when they're able to plan around a certain set of objectives and a certain set of interests. And so they've been pretty clear in public in the last few days that they would not welcome that.